Here we are. And Banishing Cancer is the subject of Module 5 in the PIH Academy. And it's my privilege and pleasure to provide you some insights that I have gleaned over the years, including my collaboration with the National Cancer Institutes when I was at the Clinical Center of NIH. And to get a sense of an overview on the next slide, we see what we're going to look at, some at a very high level, some in great detail. We're going to look at the prevalence of types of cancer, their distribution in men and women, something about their origins. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on the innate cancer defense mechanisms, cytotoxic T cells, natural killer cells, circulating tumor cells, and how the T cells of the body and the immune system of the body manages. And then in the middle, you see at the top, cancer detection markers. There are many, although they are mostly useful comparing an individual with themselves and not as a measure of the presence or absence of cancer, but we'll get into that. We'll look at environmental influences, which are really very profound. Pesticides, herbicides like glyphosate, household materials that are less rather than more toxic, we want to recommend to you household materials that are less, not more toxic. And we will talk about prions, those very interesting infectious particles that have no genetic material. They're a controlling protein that hijacks your cell. And there are many infectious agents that basically hijack your cellular machinery when you're hospitable. And we'll talk about the hospitable host and how to not be hospitable. On the right side of this slide, you see repair mechanisms. We'll talk about predictive biomarkers and the self-tests. We'll talk about food choices, because you can reduce or increase your cancer risk based on your food choices. We'll talk about nutrients and restorative sleep and its role as a cancer prophylactic and response. And we'll look at mind-body practices, mindfulness practices, including spiritual healing, the mind-body connection, and spontaneous remissions. Now, on the next slide, we take a page out of the Center for Disease Control fact documents. And what you see is that prostate cancer had a dramatic increase in the 80s and into the 90s. Because at that time, we were doing a lot of biopsies, and we learned from that most prostate cancer is pretty benign. And if you leave it alone, it's in the category of don't trouble till trouble troubles you. Now, we will talk specifically about the prostate and what I recommend as a minimally invasive and effective strategy and tactic clinically to manage prostate risk in your clients. You will notice that lung and bronchus cancers have gone down in proportion to people smoking less. Colorectal cancers have gone down for a variety of reasons, not terribly clear. Bladder cancers have been constant. Melanomas of the skin have been increasing, as have liver and thyroid in men. In women, the great cancer of concern is breast. And again, we'll talk about it because breast cancer for women is like prostate cancer for men, or risks. As you see, in women, the colorectal cancers have been coming down. Lung and bronchus were increasing and are beginning to come down. They increased in proportion to women's increased smoking and indoor air pollution. Uterine cancers have been fairly flat, that is constant. Thyroid and melanoma, thyroid and skin cancers have been increasing. And liver has been low prevalence, but of course, when it occurs, it's a big problem. Now, on the next slide, and I urge you to come back and look at this when you want. This is kind of the overall epidemiology of cancer. You start with prevalence. It turns out in men, the most prevalent cancer is indeed prostate, and in women, indeed breast. But on the bottom of the slide, you see deaths calculated or estimated for each cancer. And now you see that lung cancer that has less men affected, less women affected, actually is more deadly. And so for those of you who are interested in the relative incidence and prevalence, we can look at this over time. The Center for Disease Control and the Agency for International Development, AID, maintain fact books that you can get online. And I recommend that to you if you have interest in some specific aspects, incidence and prevalences of cancers, even by zip code, if you're that interested. Now, on the next slide, we take a very high level view. How do you define cancer? Well, cancer means that certain cells are abnormal and begin to divide without stopping and spread into surrounding tissues. And it's a collection of related diseases. There are many different kinds of cancer. There are many different causes, different kinds of cancer. And the point we want to emphasize is that we all make cancer cells, and therefore deleting cancer cells needs elective, protective immune systems and restorative sleep. And we want to restore tolerance in your immune defense and repair system. We want to show you how to prepare for and gain restorative sleep, because healthy people do not get cancer. Now, what you see on the right is a cell in mitosis. It's a cell dividing. It's actually a scanning electron micrograph that's been colorized, and it happens to be a breast cancer cell. So uncontrolled division. Now, cells wear out. They need to be replaced. We need to divide and then stop dividing. And we have many healthy, innate, and adaptive immune mechanisms and nutritional approaches that manage this challenge. And we'll talk about them, starting with the fact that we all make abnormal cancer cells every day, and we delete them when we're healthy, when we have elective protective immune systems, and we get restorative sleep. On the next slide, we look at innate cancer defense mechanisms. And I want to start here on the lower left, elimination. So you eliminate abnormal cells through cytotoxic T and NK natural killer cells. NR4A1 is a specific fluorescent subtype, and macrophages come in and they help identify and eliminate the abnormal cells, as do neutrophils. And tumor antigens, usually because of environmental toxins that have altered the structure of the body, can cause T cell priming to prevent abnormal tumor antigens translating into tumors. And then the third, you see apoptosis. That's one word for programmed cell death. Necrosis, another aseptic or septic. It's not always, necrosis is often aseptic, often not infectious. Engulfment and vasculature normalization. Very often you want to make new blood vessels, but you want to make them where you want them and not where you don't. And if a cancer is to grow, it must set up its own blood supply. Now, if we look at the upper left, tumor proliferation, there are angiogenesis factors. VEGF is the acronym for one. There was a very famous researcher at Children's Hospital in Boston who did very important work on the role of angiogenesis. And if you could cut off the growing blood supply, you would have a therapy for cancer. And eventually we may, but it hasn't happened yet, because the things that shut off angiogenesis shut it off too much. And you need a certain amount of blood vessel repair every day for the worn out blood vessels. And there is lymphangiogenesis. There is modeling. Neutrophil elastase turns out to be important in this context. It's a research tool, not a clinical tool at the moment. Immunosuppressive, such as IL-10. You can measure interleukin 10, IL-10, in the blood. TGF-beta, tolerogenic dendritic cells, usually primordial, usually immature cells. Epithelial to mesenchymal transitions. It turns out that we used to think that the three types of cells were distinct embryologically and in terms of their anatomy. It turns out they can interchange. A mesenchymal or muscular cell can wiggle up to the surface of a blood vessel on the inside, where an endothelial cell, endothelial, not mesothelial, an endothelial cell has dropped off and become an endothelial cell. The more we learn how much there is to learn. And then, of course, there's the issue of cancer cell proliferation, because cells should regulate their own division, and they should get certain nutritional and other environmental feedback that says enough is enough, but not too much. If you go around to the upper right, you can identify and recruit two metastatic sites. This is where cells have broken off and gone to other places like lung, bone, liver. And if you get the natural killer cells and cytotoxic T cells and resident macrophages and what are called CD103 dendritic cells revved up, nutritionally enhanced, given what they need, they can very often eliminate transformed or abnormal cells. And again, apoptosis comes into this. If you look at the lower right, metastatic colonization depends upon a pre-metastatic niche, that is a repair deficit, a permeability of the tissues, down-regulation of natural killer cells, immunosuppressive macrophages go up, but they don't get to talk with the other necessary cells to do the job. And you can have debris deposited, which is irritating to the body. Now, if we look at the next slide, we get to our friends cytotoxic T cells. These cells go by many different names. They have been identified by many different researchers who each gave them a name. Sometimes it's a capital T with a subscript C, cytotoxic T lymphocyte, CTL/T killer cell, cytolytic T cell, CD8. You may be familiar with CD4 and CD8. CD8s eliminate, CD4s upregulate killer T cells, and they're designed to kill abnormal cells, mostly by apoptosis. And they're mostly designed to identify cancer cells and eliminate them, to identify virally transfected cells and eliminate them, to identify metabolically damaged cells because of environmental toxins and eliminate them. And the reference here is to Charlie Janeway and others who were pioneers in the immunology of cancer, and that is still an emerging area. If you look on the right, and you may want to come back and review this at your leisure, when there is a need, certain clones of T-class lymphocytes are upregulated so that they can deliver what's called a lethal hit. That is, they can tag and program the cell so that it commits cell suicide by apoptosis, deletion of cells by biochemical mechanisms. And on the next slide, we see the mechanism of action of these NK natural killer cells. Now, cancer and infected cells lose a recognition site called MHC1, major histocompatibility site 1. That is a very important place where cells recognize signals from hormones to antigens that have been processed. And when you lose that, it's a loss of control for that cell. Dedifferentiated cells are vulnerable to natural killer cell deletion because they are dedifferentiated. You want differentiated cells, not dedifferentiated cells. NK cells release cytotoxic granules containing perforin and granzymes, and these are the classes of biological chemicals that work their way through the cell and cause it to lysis by apoptosis of the target cell. And healthy people, those with elective protective immune defense and repair systems, have several billion natural killer cells at any one time. And to help explain this in a relatively straightforward and simple way for most consumers, I've included on the right an image that you can download from NIH. from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases on natural killer cells and how they work and why they're important. Now, on the next slide, we look at we look at circulating cancer or tumor cells, known as CTC, circulating tumor cells. These are cancer cells that leave and can seed metastases in distant organisms. It's bidirectional. Sometimes the cells go back to the cancer, sometimes they are exported from the cancer. They travel through the bloodstream or the lymphatic system. And there is interest today in what's called a CTC liquid biopsy. That is, taking a blood specimen and looking for circulating cancer tumor cells, and then culturing them to identify what their weaknesses are. On the right side here, you see circulating tumor cells. You see the diagram of a tumor and the release of individual cells, CTC, circulating tumor cells, that can go and seed metastases, but hopefully should trigger a healthier immune defense and repair response and eliminate not just the seeding cells, not just the cells that are trying to metastasize, but also the primary tumor itself. Now, on the next slide, we look at a variety of tumor markers that are associated with a variety of tumors. And here I want to jump kind of to my conclusion, which is, if you compare an individual with themselves over time, these markers have meaning. But any given measurement, any single measurement, is not sensitive or specific enough. It's not accurate and predictive enough. So I do not do what I would call clinical tumor marker screenings on everyone or everyone over a certain age. However, we are conscious of the individual and their situation and their family history and their environment and their risk factors and so forth. And I might selectively do specific tumor markers if there were increased risks or concerns about specific tumors. But then I would follow those markers every 3 to 6 months, because changes in those markers for that individual has meaning. A single test in my clinical experience lacks both sensitivity and specificity. Therefore, it's very hard to interpret. And I wouldn't do it unless I had a reason, a logical reason. And I would do it if I plan to follow that marker for that individual over time, maybe along with other markers, including IL-10, TNF, HSCRP, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, our favorite marker of repair deficit and the repair need. So that's what I want to say about detection markers. Many have been proposed when they have been applied to larger groups of people. It turns out they are only helpful when comparing an individual with themselves over time. Now, on the next slide, we look at what many of us consider to be the classic marker, CA125. This is CA125. It's the cancer antigen 125th one that was very carefully teased apart many years ago. Women with high ovarian cancer risk very often have elevated CA125s. However, its usefulness, its sensitivity, its specificity has been challenged by many. It is found to be elevated in certain individuals with ovarian cancer, with adenocarcinoma, with endometrial adenocarcinoma, gastrointestinal tract, GIT carcinoma, breast cancer. Now, this slide actually comes from the United Kingdom, where instead of saying GI, they say GIT. And for those 5 cancers, it has a higher usefulness. But again, it has the issue of sensitivity and specificity. And I find it helpful if I'm going to compare an individual with themselves over time. Now, the next slide has another of these tumor markers. This one is known as AFP, alpha fetoprotein. Biochemists and molecular immunologists are not very creative they're very descriptive about their names. This was the alpha, the first fetoprotein. This was something you would find in an embryo, but not in an adult, that seemed to reappear when cells de-differentiated, when they went back to being undifferentiated. And less than 10 nanograms per ml for adults is considered to be acceptable. It is particularly helpful in liver, testicular, and ovarian cancer to monitor therapy and to compare an individual with themselves over time. But again, as an individual probe, its usefulness, sensitivity, and specificity have been challenged by many. And you'll hear me say several times that these markers may be helpful comparing an individual with themselves over time, but they are not in and of themselves either diagnostic or sufficiently predictive to be useful in regard to general community risks. Now let's move on to the next of these markers. This one is the PSA, the prostate-specific antigen, PSA. It is a protein made by the prostate. For most laboratories, their upper limit is 2.5 to 3, although each lab seems to have its own. The percent-free PSA can be helpful. I will tell you that my own father had an elevated PSA, and it turned out to be prostatitis because he was a salesman. He traveled in his car, and he very often held his urine because he wanted to get somewhere, and eventually got prostatitis, but fortunately not prostate cancer. Then there's complex PSA, there's free and complex, and I think the percentage can be helpful to distinguish prostatitis from prostate cancer risk. Then there is something called the Prostate Health Index that combines multiple tests that were found to be somewhat deficient in and of themselves, and they thought if they put them together, that would be more sensitive and specific. There is also something called the 4K score test, which includes total PSA, free PSA, intact PSA, human kallikrein too. And that's an interesting test, again, if you're going to compare an individual with themselves over time. I do not favor biopsies of the prostate. I think that irritates the prostate and very often doesn't help. I do recommend a prostate MRI for any man over 40, especially anyone who has any changes in their urine flow or stream. Now, a prostate MRI requires a special magnet, a special cone. So it's not a routine MRI machine. It's available in many areas, and it is something that I have found useful. And again, I can compare an individual over time with a non-invasive prostate MRI. And on the right, you see that in regard to PSA tests, prostate-specific antigen tests, very often anything that has irritated the prostate will cause the PSA to go up. And that has led to many procedures, maybe even surgeries, where the pathologist says, well, fortunately, it was either encapsulated, which means it wasn't going anywhere, the tumor, or there really wasn't a tumor. But what there was inflammation and repair deficit, an elevation in the PSA, a persistent elevation in the PSA. And today, I would say the more informed colleagues know that's of limited value, whereas a prostate MRI can be really very helpful, especially if you compare a person with themselves over time. Same machine, preferably, same technician if you could. And now there's another test. This one may be familiar to you. And on the next slide, we see the HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. Usually undetectable in men and in non-pregnant women. In fact, it's the basis for the most common pregnancy test. It plays a role in cell transformation, angiogenesis, new blood vessel formation, metastasization, that is, spread of tumors, and immune escape. This is all related to cancer progression. However, healthy women who get pregnant have lots of HCG that's necessary for the baby to develop inside the mother's womb. and they don't have cancer. So there's much we need to learn about the functionality and the interrelationships with HCG. This is particularly about trophoblastic diseases and testicular cancers. It is, of course, elevated in pregnancy, but also in testicular failure, infertility. You can help diagnose, monitor treatment, and determine recurrence by following HCG over time. It's a non-invasive test, it's a urine test. You can look for it in the blood, but the urine is the usual specimen. And I think it's a valuable tool for the clinician to be aware of. Human chorionic gonadotropin HCG. On the next slide, we look at another test. This is the calcitonin hormone test. Calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid and parathyroid glands. It controls bone turnover. Oh, well, that's kind of important. We want to make new bones and have healthy, flexible bones. High blood levels may denote thyroid medullary carcinoma, so that's a reason to do the test in at-risk people. It's highly sensitive. If it's abnormal, it's likely there is a problem, but it's not too specific, which means if you don't have the problem, you could still have an elevated calcitonin. So there are false positives, and therefore it needs to be investigated carefully by a clinician focusing on thyroid, parathyroid, pituitary, hormone relationships. On the next slide, you see what for us is a very important and growing area of concern and risk: environmental influences from PCBs and PBBs and 2,4-D, and their role in inducing cancers of the digestive system and other parts of the body. Dioxins, heptachlor and its cousin ketone, DDT and DDE. When I was a youngster, we used to ride our bikes behind the fog trucks. These were trucks that would fog the area to reduce mosquitoes with DDT. We don't do that anymore, but DDT and DDE live long in the environment for reasons we'll talk about, because they are, like many of these, not just hormone disruptors, but they're forever molecules. They stay in the body until you proactively get them out, and we'll talk about how to get them out safely and effectively. And this includes the asbestos and fiberglass that is associated with mesothelioma and other problems. Cancer in the Environment is a text that we recommend, as are the references here. And on the top right, you see the many steps from an abnormal cell before you get a symptomatic cancer. And it takes a long time. And we think it is about time to look upstream at the immune defense and repair system and elective protective mechanisms, and either celebrate that they are present or restore them if they are not. If you look on the next slide with me, we see glyphosate, which is now being found almost everywhere. Any of the GMO, any of the genetically manipulated grains like soybean or corn or wheat are known to contain glyphosate. I just learned that many hummus samples, that's a condiment made out of sesame seeds and garbanzo beans, contain glyphosate. Turns out most toothpaste contains glyphosate. And glyphosate is a hormone disruptor. It wastes magnesium. It induces DNA damage. It's associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's also associated with mitochondrial and neurotransmitter alterations of function. And Monsanto was bought by Bayer, a European company. And by the way, I will tell you that the acquiring company, Bayer, has had its market capitalization reduced by $40 billion because of the legal liability globally due to glyphosate. Just glyphosate, and there may be others to follow, but very important references. You can see the amounts, really staggering amounts. You can see the distribution on this map. It's mostly where you would expect, which is the center part of the country where most of our corn and soybeans and wheat and so forth are grown. But then it turns out there's a big concentration in the Salinas Valley in California, where a lot of our vegetables are grown. So glyphosate, reduce it, avoid it, eliminate it to the extent that you can. And now, let's look at the next slide. And now we're going to take a moment to talk about household materials. And the headline is, traditional, yes, convenient brings problems. Convenience brings problems. The classic example is Teflon, a PFOA, a polyfluorinated compound that is a non-stick coating that was introduced because food didn't stick. But over time, we found that when you used certain implements in these non-stick coated pans, they scratched. And as soon as they started scratching, then vinyl chloride and microplastics and so forth came out, went to the liver, brain, lung, and induced lymphoma and leukemias, went to places that are fat-loving, and just built up over time, creating problems. And the small world story is that the man who synthesized, the chemist who synthesized Teflon, happened to go to the small synagogue that my dad and I, or my family and I, went to. His name was Lukens. His son David became chief of staff for Senator Moynihan. His other son Danny became a well-regarded psychiatrist. His wife was a mathematics professor at RPI, very distinguished family. And I asked him whether he allowed his wife to use Teflon-coated pans in their home. And he vehemently and vigorously said, absolutely not, far too toxic, no one should use them. I'm embarrassed that the company continues to sell this. Yes, I synthesized it, but I can tell you that I wouldn't let anyone I loved or cared for use a non-stick pan. Now, you can get a cast iron pan and properly season it. You can get traditional cookware, stainless steel or copper clad or this or that, and you just learn how to cook at lower temperatures. So you don't make what's in my family called carbano cuisine. And that was made, describing dad leaving something on the stove until it was not edible anymore. Non-stick coatings are for convenience. We recommend avoiding them, and I would give away those pans if you have a non-stick pan and go to traditional cooking and kitchen materials. On the next slide, we see that diet does influence the process. Red meat, for a lot of reasons, especially if you cook it at high temperature to a char, the answer is no. Braising, baking, boiling even, yes. You can make a meat broth out of 100% grass-fed animal that is really quite nutritious and easy to digest and assimilate. But most of the meat, most of the chicken, most of the fish contains too much contaminants and not enough of the nutrients, and that's a problem. Sugar is empty calories. Calories are important, but the quality of the calorie is much more important. So we want nutrient-dense calories. You're sweet enough as you are. You don't need added sugar in your diet. Alcohol, especially in nutritionally compromised people, goes to acetaldehyde. That damages the DNA and other cells. And there are people with alcohol dehydrogenase deficiency, including some in my micro practice, and we have helped them over the years live in harmony with their nature, which includes them not taking alcohol, outside alcohol. Processed and packaged foods increase your cancer risk. GMO grains, cow dairy, and biocides increase your cancer risk. And if you look just back to about 1900, you find that 1% of adults over 40 years of age would get cancer. Today, it's 1 in 3. So it's a dramatic change in a relatively small period of time. And to emphasize that point, every 10% increase in packaged snacks, fizzy drinks, sugary cereals, or other processed foods boosts the risk of cancer by 12%. So here you can reduce the convenience foods, the highly processed foods, and reduce your risk, Or if you take those foods, then you should be increasing your pronutrient. You should be increasing your essential nutrient intake because you are cruising for a bruise. If we look at the next slide, it's about another item that I think is worth a few minutes of our discussion, and this is prions. It turns out that prions are foreign to the cell, and when the cell lacks antioxidants, when the cell lacks ascorbate and therefore has a high oxidation reduction potential, a high redox, then the prions can get in. And in a high redox environment, antioxidant deficient and magnesium deficient, so you're both not protected from oxidative damage and you're on the acid side because of a lack of magnesium. According to Giuseppe Lignami, who worked with the Nobelists who identified prions, the difference between a healthy and an unhealthy prion has to do with your redox and the acid-alkaline balance and magnesium status. So if you have metabolic acidosis and magnesium deficiency, if you have ascorbate deficiency and a high redox, now the prion proteins stack on themselves to the point where they physically damage the cell, cause the cell to rupture. And in that sense, abnormal prions, unhealthy prions, behave like oncogenic proteins such as P53. They are the target for a variety of therapeutic interventions in malignant tumors and pancreatic cancers and the like. So read the work of Giuseppe Lignami and others and follow our guidance in the meantime to keep your ascorbate up and your pH alkaline, which means you have enough magnesium and choline citrate, as well as enough of the family of antioxidants, but particularly ascorbate, the maternal antioxidant that sacrifices herself, that all others can be recycled and conserved. If we look at the next slide, we meet Sir Denis Burkitt. He received a Nobel Prize for identifying a lymphoma, pediatric lymphoma, a fast and aggressive growing lymphoma that affected the lymphatic system and specifically B-class lymphocytes, and particularly people who are antioxidant and magnesium deficient, predisposing them to a virus called Epstein-Barr, EBV, Epstein-Barr virus. Now, most EBV, most Epstein-Barr virus is benign, but in some people with other comorbidities, it's a significant risk factor. And I knew Professor Burkitt near the end of his life, and he said that there were so many calls and journalists and people trying to get time with him after he won the Nobel Prize, that he took his family to Kenya and he became a missionary, a medical missionary. And after 20 years in Africa, he came back and reported that the people who had a high fiber traditional diet and lifestyle had no IBS, IBD, no UC, no regional enteritis, no Crohn's disease, etc. However, when the same people moved to the city with the stresses of the city and the toxins of the city, now irritable bowel and other digestive disorders emerged. So it was from Dr. Denis Burkitt that I learned we need prebiotics, probiotics, and symbiotics, 40 to 100 grams of prebiotic fiber, 40 to 100 billion probiotic organisms, and the recycled glutamine, that is the symbiotic that energizes and repairs the lining cells, the enterocytes, the lining cells of the intestines, and does other good things in terms of building nitric oxide and other beneficial metabolic consequences. If we move on to the next slide, there's a gentleman who deserves to be remembered. His name was Professor William Coley, and he took extracts of streptococcal bacteria, created what he called a bacterial vaccine in the late 1800s, and use it often with success in bone and soft tissue sarcomas. However, endotoxin came along with these cultured organisms and very often created not just elevated temperatures, but fevers that had adverse effects on the person. And the therapy really has fallen out of favor in the last probably 80 years. So it had a brief vogue in the late 1800s. It's not in fashion at the moment. Endotoxin is something we really try to avoid today. And in our Q&A time, if you want, we can talk about how hard it is to get something that will evoke the immune system's response with an extract of a bacteria or a virus without risking endotoxemia, which you do want to avoid. Now, if we move on to where we would suggest people today start, they would start with these 4 self-assessments. First, morning urine pH to assess for metabolic acidosis and magnesium choline citrate need. Digestive transit time, so you can check if people can digest, assimilate, and eliminate the foods they eat without immune burdens. A score based on the C cleanse, and hydration. Very important self-assessments, very easy to do. We have them available in little kits so that folks at home can do them, log the information, bring it back to you for interpretation. And it leads most often, as we see on the next slide, to the predictive biomarkers that predict your epigenetic quality of life. They also determine your functional age. And I want your functional age to be half of your biological age. And if we look at the 8 predictive biomarkers, and we screened over 100,000 laboratory tests to find out what covered all of epigenetics, all of lifestyle, all of the things you could influence. And these 8 tests do the job. Hemoglobin A1C should be less than 5%. HSCRP should be less than 0.5. Homocysteine in the plasma should be less than 6. LRA, lymphocyte response assays, should be tolerant and have no reactions. The urine pH after rest should be between 6.5 and 7.5. The vitamin D, the 25-hydroxy D, should be between 50 and 80. The omega-3 index should be more than 8%. And the 8-hydroxy desoxyguanine, the 8-oxoguanine, should be less than 5 nanograms per milligram of creatinine. Now, the first 7 should be somewhat familiar, and we can certainly talk more about them. The 8th, the one that's on the bottom, the one that's in purple, is the test of DNA oxidative damage, because you want your DNA to be repaired continuously. You do not want it to have excess oxidative damage, and 8-oxoguanine is that test. We have written this up in a textbook. You're welcome to contact us, and we'll send you the chapters and or the reviews on predictive biomarkers and how they really make medicine today personalized and truly proactive. Now, on the next slide, we're going to begin to look at the ways in which your diet can reduce risk. So, for example, if your diet is rich in seeds, flax seeds, sesame seeds, hemp seeds, mustard seeds, you have lots of lignin, and lignin is one of the best fibers to bind toxins and prevent them being reabsorbed and to get them more quickly out of the digestive tract. Your omega-3 to omega-6 balance, they are both essential. We need both. But as the last NHANES data, and particularly Artemis Simopoulos has pointed out, most of us who eat processed food have way too much omega-6 and way too little omega-3. So reduce the processed food to reduce the omega-6, increase the omega-3 in diet and in supplements, micellized and of course distilled under nitrogen to remove toxins from the fish oils. Supplements that include selenomethionine, not selenite or selenate, but selenomethionine, tocopherols and tocotrienols, the vitamins E, and carotenoids, the whole family of colorful carotenoids, and other phytonutrients. Because if your diet is rich in chlorophyll and sulforaphane and dithiothione and isothiocyanates and indole carbinol and isoflavones and protease inhibitors and saponins and phytosterols and inositol hexaphosphate, known as IP6, and limonene. It's a lemon terpene, and lutein, one of the carotenoids. And of course, our favorites, G, G, O, B, and E, garlic, ginger, onions, broccoli sprouts, and eggs. For garlic, we recommend an entire bulb per person. For ginger, a thumb-sized piece per person. Onions, a whole onion sauteed per person, clarified per person. Broccoli sprouts, all sprouts are good, but broccoli sprouts are particularly rich in sulforaphane and IP6 and other good things. And for eggs, where possible, we recommend goose, duck, and quail. Biodynamic and organic chicken eggs are acceptable, but commercial chicken eggs today have too many contaminants, and we suggest that you have the duck, the goose, the quail, or the organic eggs by choice and preference. Now, next slide, and we look at restorative sleep and how important that is in regard to impaired resilience, endurance, and output, suppressed immune defense and repair, memory problems, cardiac issues, including hypertension and atrial fibrillation, weight management issues, and at least 60 million Americans suffer from sleep-related issues. I learned from a guy named Jimenez, who was at Stanford for many years, just recently passed away, but really a giant studying sleep quality, the stages of sleep, and how important restorative sleep is, especially to reduce cancer risk or to help manage cancer in the individuals who are afflicted by it. On the next slide, we see a visual from Matthew Walker about mind, body, and spirit. It turns out, if you follow our guidance, if you follow what is recommended here, learning your nature and living in harmony with it, putting good stuff in and reducing the bad stuff exposures, getting the bad stuff out by choice, and by having a harmony between your physical, your mental, and your spiritual well-being. They asked the Buddha, supposedly, what he gained from enlightenment, and he told his disciples it wasn't what he gained, it's what he lost. He lost fear. He lost anxiety. He lived in the moment. In fact, the metaphor is that if you live in the past, you'll get depressed. If you live in the future, you'll get anxious. So live in the moment. Be a nowist. I do my best to appreciate each breath. Having had a near-death experience does really help you with your gratitude component, especially on rising in the morning. And you can see that there's much we can do by choice and by trained habit, by habits we cultivate, to improve the restorative sleep, and with it to improve every aspect of our mind, our body, and our spirit. Now, let's look on the next slide, and we'll talk about a few individuals who have taken individual approaches to this issue. And here we have William Donald Kelly, a dentist, and Nicholas Gonzalez, who was originally a journalist and became a physician. My understanding is he went to debunk William Donald Kelly and became a student of his. Kelly used a lot of digestive enzymes and a lot of daily supplements, vitamins and minerals. He used Laetrile, known as amygdalin, frequent body shampoos, detoxification with coffee enemas, a very rigid diet, and prayer and osteopathic manipulation. Nick Gonzalez himself died relatively young. He, for many years, tried to get proper studies of what's called the Kelly method. The few people I know who have done it have found it to be so arduous and so rigorous and so restrictive that it doesn't have a lot of currency, shall I say, at the moment. But certainly a man who deserves to be remembered and respected. Dr. William Donald Kelly and Dr. Nicholas or Nick Gonzalez. If you look at the next slide with me, we see another giant of cancer innovation. It's the Nagorny Cancer Institute, named for Dr. Robert Nagorny. It's also known as Rational Therapeutics. And what they do is they take a biopsy from the cancer patient, a biopsy of the cancer. They grow it in the laboratory, and they end up with an ex vivo analysis of programmed cell death, what he calls EVA-PCD. And whatever therapy the tumor cells like least is what he recommends. In my experience, superior to genomic testing. Bob has been at this for decades. He's in the Long Beach area, and certainly someone who I admire in this area of rational cancer therapeutics. If we now look at the next slide, we find traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, something I went to debunk in the 70s and became a student of Qing Wu and then taught to physicians. And it turns out that many of the herbs we recognize today, including turmeric with curcumin, resveratrol from grape seeds, berberine and others, they all decrease excess DNA methylation. They enhance histone repair functions. Histones are these enzymes that shuttle up and down the DNA and the RNA, identifying damage and replacing it. They are important in the non-coding RNA regulation, which turns out to be really important, even though we didn't understand it until more recently. And so traditional Chinese medicine has been able to modulate tumor microenvironments for millennia. And the goal is to inhibit the viability of cancer stem cells. And you're welcome to look at the visual on the right to see how many ways in which natural products and the philosophy of TCM lead to a holistic approach to cancer management. If we look together at the next slide, we see two people whom I admire a lot and I think deserve remembrance. The first is the Simonton method, Carl and Stephanie Simonton. It so happens that their next door neighbor was George Leone, a student of Dr. Mishra, and he provided the funds for the original Simonton studies in Fort Worth, Texas. So they took cognitive behavioral elements and relaxation exercises. They developed a guided imagery and guided meditation approach. The aim is to prolong survival time and quality of life. And it is particularly interesting to me that when you look at the people who benefit, the people who just were passive and repeated the quote meditation did not get much benefit. The people who were angry, who were passionate about wanting to get rid of the cancer, they were the ones who were able to visualize their body's immune defense and repair and anti-cancer mechanisms coming to their aid and benefiting them. And then on the right, you see Dan Goleman. He has written a number of books. He is part of the Mind and Life Institute under the patronage of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And one of his best books, although I think everything he's written is really well written and worth reading, is Emotional Intelligence, something we could use more of at every level of society today. And it's really about self-awareness and mindfulness. If we look at the next slide, we continue this dip into visualization and guided imagery. The mind is powerful and can help. It's an adjunct to healing any illness, including cancer. It turns out that imagining pictures, sounds, smells, and other senses is associated with reaching a goal, like identifying and eliminating abnormal cells, and an environment, a quiet environment to activate the senses, producing desired physical or psychological effects. This could involve listening to classic music, or it could involve just ambling under a canopy in a mature woods. Benefits include increased NK, natural killer cell counts, interleukin 2 levels go up, that's helpful. It helps reduce the feelings of depression that accompany many cancers. It increases the feelings of well-being, which improve your anti-cancer mechanisms, and it's a valuable adjunct to medical therapy. And here you see one of many sources, cancer healing visualization, that you may want to include in your toolkit. On the next slide, we look at some of my favorite people. In the 1970s, I heard that in Northwest Baltimore, there was the New Life Clinic at the Mount Washington Methodist Church, led by Ambrose and Olga Worrell, and that many people who came by for their touch, their laying on of hands healing service, sent them reports from their medical professionals of spontaneous remissions. Now, they founded the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship in the 1950s. They advised the United Nations on spiritual matters when Dag Hammarskjöld was the Secretary General of the UN. Their work continues, and they've been succeeded by Dr. Robert Leichman, my friend and colleague, to this day. You see a picture of Olga and Ambrose, and I heard Olga say that when Ambrose proposed to her, she asked him to think twice because she heard things other people didn't hear and saw things other people didn't see, and he said, "So do I, dear, we'll be okay." And I understand that they would fall asleep at night holding hands so that they could go out of body together to visit the Celestial University for spiritual guidance. And Paloma Cerruti, who was a lawyer, was so enamored by Olga that she wrote a book called Olga Worrell. I think it's Mystic with the Healing Hands is the subtitle, but it's an easy read. It's put out by Ariel Press and Books of Light. And I would recommend Ariel Press and Books of Light as sources of spiritual awareness, and especially for people who like to read about subjects having to do with a mind and body that heal well. On the next slide, we see some other people who are important to me in regard to my skeptical phase and their gracious willingness to show me evidence. Bernie Grad at McGill University is considered by some to be the father of modern healing science. He studied Olga Worrell, he studied other people. He, for example, showed that if Mrs. Worrell put her hands around a plant, it grew faster, whereas the same kind of plant with the same sourced seed, handled exactly the same way, but without her non-invasive touch, grew more slowly. I participated in experiments where Mrs. Worrell was able to influence a Jabotinsky chemical reaction. And so there really is some very interesting science that has been done on evoking the human healing response or inhibiting it, the nocebo and the placebo responses. And I think we can today talk about human healing responses and how to evoke them. And here particularly, I am reminded of, I remember Dr. Hugh Reardon of the Reardon Clinic in Wichita, Kansas. He was a psychiatrist who got interested in orthomolecular medicine, nutrition and vitamins in particular. And one aspect of his work had to do with cancer and the use of IV vitamin C in relatively large amounts. From him, I learned that you should have a peak vitamin C plasma level of 50 to 80 milligrams per deciliter and a trough level of 10 to 15. And what that means in practice is that you would be doing infusions at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, so that your peak level was beneficial, but the trough level just before the next infusion was sufficient, not insufficient. On the next slide, we recognize that there is spontaneous healing, spontaneous remission. There are many, many reports in the cancer literature of spontaneous remissions, or what's called a St. Peregrine tumor. St. Peregrine was a 13th century monk who developed what seemed to be a very aggressive cancer. And however, it spontaneously remitted. And a few centuries later, he became a saint, and he is the patron saint of cancer. So spontaneous remissions exist. We should understand that better. And I think anything that helps a person understand that human healing responses are the human right, not privilege, can then can be helped to focus their natural anti-cancer mechanisms, best case resulting in a, quote, spontaneous remission. On the next slide, we introduce another dimension to the issue, and that's transgenerational influences. And here in specific is Paul Brenner, a physician who was from background was OBGYN, was at Scripps Clinic, did some of the early research on acupuncture in this country, helped Norm Shealy found the American Holistic Medical Association. And for some years now, he has been doing counseling, mostly with cancer patients. And he finds transgenerational influences in many cases to be important. And when they're witnessed, not re-experienced, but when they're observed and witnessed in a safe place, along with a healthier diet and all the other things we're talking about, very often people have remissions. And then there is Dr. Louis Mayo Madrona. Coyote Healing is one of his books. He's a Lakota Cherokee medicine man. He's also an MD, PhD. And he teaches principles of Native American healing to healers today. And I am very grateful to Louis because from our point of view, he saved our son Sky's life. Another story for another time. But meeting Louis was a great gift. And he has remained a colleague and someone whom I hold in very high esteem. Now, on the next slide, I've just picked a few cancer pioneers, including William Osler, Sir William Osler, whose textbook of medicine includes the following comment: never treat the diagnosis nor the disease. Always treat the unique individual in front of you. And then Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was, I think, most famous as a jurist, but was also a physician. And he famously said, if you took all the cancer treatments and put them in a great sea trunk and threw it in the ocean, it would be all the better for the patients and all the worser for the fishes. Then there's Paul Dudley White, who we mostly revere as a cardiologist. He helped refine electrocardiography, ECG. He was a giant in his field. He was President Eisenhower's personal physician in the 1950s. And he was still active when I was a student in the 60s in Boston. And he could talk as compellingly about the choices that produce cancer as the choices that produce heart disease. So he did think it was a choice, and I agree with him. Then there's Donald Fredrickson, who was the director of NIH when I was at the clinical center. Many people consider him to be the last really strong director of NIH, specifically because when people on Capitol Hill wanted him to come testify, he explained that he had a full-time job running the National Institutes of Health. They could come up, they had a red carpet, they would be briefed, and then they could go back to Capitol Hill. In policy arenas, where you hold the meeting turns out to be sometimes very important. So he knew who and he knew how. He made sure that the budget at NIH was favored on Capitol Hill in congressional halls. And he really was the director of NIH through some of its most glorious years in the 1970s. Then he moved on to be the first director of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and deserves our recognition, even though he had the diet heart hypothesis, which was incorrect about cardiovascular disease, he still knew how to promote good science and to get the community at large to understand the importance of doing original science, not focused or highly predictive science. You had to do experiments that surprised you if you wanted to do really innovative science. And then William Donald Kelly, who I mentioned, a dentist who I think as a cancer pioneer deserves to be appreciated and recognized. And if we look at the next slide, we see some of the health pioneers that I've had the privilege of associating with. This includes Bob Maley. In that photo, he is the head of the Gladstone Cardiovascular Institute at UCSF. He, Don Fry, and I collaborated in the 70s on animal models of heart disease, but he also has done very important work on human healing responses and repair deficits. Then there's Don Berwick, who was asked by President Obama to run the Center for Medicare Studies. He had the Institute for Healthcare Improvement at Harvard. He's a pediatrician by training. He's now mostly working in the health policy arena because it's his view, as it is mine, that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and it shouldn't be determined by your zip code or your socioeconomic status. And then you see Elliot Fisher, who runs the Dartmouth Atlas, who keeps the database for Medicare on a zip code by zip code, condition by condition basis. And it turns out in some situations, the high cost area is the high risk area, and the low cost area has better outcomes, subjects that we will discuss over different modules. If we look at the next slide, we come back to these 8 predictive biomarkers that I consider to be seminal, essential in understanding the individual, their functional capacities and qualities. And we want to interpret these to their best outcome value, which is what you see on the far right, not the lab range. So the lab range makes statistics out of people and really should be forgotten at this point and replaced by the best outcome value for that analyte, for that item that's being assayed. So we know these 8 predictive biomarkers cover epigenetics. We know that when you cover all of epigenetics, you have covered 92% of lifetime health or quality of life. QOL is the abbreviation for quality of life. And we recommend coming into the 21st century, recognizing that it's stressful and intoxicated, that we're marinating in a sea of toxins. But now that we know what the best outcome value is, we can help guide people with each of these 8 predictive biomarkers into a lifestyle that brings them to their best outcome or goal value. And I will tell you, for example, that my hemoglobin A1C was well above 5% some years ago when I was 60 pounds heavier than I am now. Having lost the weight and planning to not find it again, I can tell you that it was a challenge, but a challenge worth accepting. And it leaves me feeling and functioning much better to have hemoglobin A1C consistently below 5%. We're all sweet enough as we are. We don't need to add sugar to our diet, certainly not empty calories, because every calorie should be nutrient dense. And so for each of these predictive biomarkers, high sensitivity C-reactive protein as the one that we feel is most predictive of repair need, known as inflammation, and then homocysteine, which needs to be done on a proper plasma or whole blood sample, processed very quickly because it tends to leak. The homocysteine tends to leak out of red cells, causing an artifactual elevation. The lymphocyte response assay to achieve tolerance is the goal. Checking your magnesium and choline citrate need to keep the pH between 6.5 and 7.5, which means 2 doses a day. Minimum maintenance needs for magnesium are about 440 milligrams of elemental magnesium. That's what you get from 2 doses of the magnesium choline citrate combo. And then you correct the choline and citrate deficiencies, so you get multiple synergistic benefits. And for each half pH unit below 6.5, you add an extra dose of the magnesium and choline citrate to correct the cellular deficiencies. So we enhance the uptake and we chaperone the retention and delivery of the magnesium in the cells that are hungry for it. Vitamin D, you should take enough vitamin D and K2, but starting with vitamin D and K2, add drops under the tongue to bring your vitamin D to 50 to 80 nanograms per ml. That allows the vitamin D to go to your brain before the body. It's really a neurohormone, although we call it a vitamin. It helps regulate cell growth. It helps tell cells to stop dividing. Then the omega-3 index, your balance of essential fats, omega-3 to 6. You want to be more than 8%, which indicates that you have reduced the omega-6 index intake, the omega-6 intake, because you reduced processed foods, and you have supplemented both diet and with micellized soft gels distilled under nitrogen with EPA DHA. We need EPA for body and brain. We need DHA for brain and body. We need both. In really healthy people, you may be able to interconvert amongst the different classes of essential fats, but the people who need them specifically have enzyme systems that are impaired or inhibited by environmental toxins, and therefore they need micellized, high uptake EPA DHA soft gels. And the last and the least familiar is the 8-oxoguanine. This is the measure of oxidative damage in your DNA. You want it to be less than 5 nanograms per milligram of creatinine. It's a spot urine, it doesn't need a 24-hour urine, and it is standardized per milligram of creatinine. You want to stay hydrated, of course. You want to have enough B complex to keep your urine sunshine yellow. You want to have a healthy digestive transit time. And if we look at the next slide, we just reprise or review those self-assessments, the first morning urine pH to determine our magnesium choline citrate intake and to banish metabolic acidosis. Digestive transit time, so that we can eat foods that we can digest, assimilate, and eliminate without immune burden. Vitamin C, ascorbate intake based on the C cleanse, and hydration, what we call the skin pinch test, because even a little bit of dehydration causes a big stress on the heart, on the kidneys, on the liver, on the lungs, on the brain, on the digestive tract. So many of us are slightly dehydrated, and what I suggest is have a carafe of water, maybe water with vitamin C in it, but have a carafe of water in a glass. And if the glass is full, drink it. And if the glass is empty, fill it. And now repeat that all day. So a healthy, hydrated person will urinate about every 2 hours while they're awake. And I do suggest after about 7 at night that you cut down on your water or herbal beverage intake so that you don't have a lot of extra water to eliminate at night. And I would want, of course, to have enough B complex to keep my urine sunshine yellow to protect my kidneys and urinary tract, where toxin and toxic metabolites are concentrated to excrete them. On the next slide, we review something we have talked about in other modules, and that is the individualization of ascorbate or vitamin C intake based on their oxidative stress. The C cleanse, healthy people, it's a half a teaspoon or 1.5 grams every 15 minutes, 6 grams an hour. Within an hour or two, most healthy people will cleanse. Moderate illness, a teaspoon, 3 grams every 15 minutes, 12 grams an hour, 24 grams in 2 hours. And most, even symptomatic people, will cleanse within a few hours. Some people need to start with 2 teaspoons, 6 grams every 15 minutes, 24 grams an hour, 48 grams in 2 hours. And sometimes it takes quite a bit. And in some cases, just before doing the cleanse, you may want to have a dose of probiotics or of recycled glutamine or of magnesium choline citrate or of the polyphenolics such as OPC and soluble OPC, each of which is separately helpful in improving digestion and digestive capacity, competence. So the ascorbate calibration, the C cleanse, something that we recommend each person to do as part of their personalized self-care and health promotion. If we see the next slide, and actually a second click so that we see the colors, thank you. No, let's go back one slide. Here we are. The yellow are the asymptomatic people. The orange are the minimally symptomatic people. The green is the 80% of the population that is typical, but notice that that's between 10 and over 100 grams to cleanse. And then there are some people who need considerably more, and that is the small group, less than 1 in 20, that are in the red category. And we can help coach you to help coach them on how to do a C cleanse and then how to adjust their daily intake of ascorbate based on their C cleanse. And we recommend repeating the C cleanse on a weekly basis because most people will ramp up. That is, as they get into repair mode, they will need more ascorbate for a period of time. Then they will reach a stable plateau where a consistent cleanse each week says they're in a consistent repair mode. And then the goal is to reach a point where the stool gets bulkier and a little more frequent, indicating you need less. And now you do the cleanse again to ramp down. So you use the cleanse on a weekly basis to ramp up and determine your daily need and intake. You stay at the plateau level until you get bulkier stools, and then you ramp down again with the help of the C cleanse. And on the next slide, we just reinforce the message in regard to the C cleanse. If the strip that you're using to measure the pH is sandy colored, you're too acidic. The pH is less than 6.5. If you're in the green, what I call Goldilocks zone, 6.5 to 7.5, that says you have enough magnesium to keep up with your needs. So take 2 doses a day of the magnesium choline citrate. And if you're too alkaline, you may be in a catabolic illness and losing ammonia and basically tearing down your lean muscle in survival need that your mitochondrial battery has. And we want to get you out of either acidosis or catabolic illness and into the middle zone, the healthy 6.5 to 7.5 pH zone, because that is the predictive goal value for urine after rest. It turns out that when you have 6 or more hours of rest, the fluid in the bladder equilibrates with the lining cells, and you can get up and go to the bathroom during the night, and that does not alter the results, but you can't go to the gym or the kitchen. So you need 6 or more hours of rest in order to equilibrate the fluid, and then the next urine that comes out once is the only time during the day when you can measure metabolic acidosis non-invasively with a urine specimen. If you want to confirm it using a venous blood gas, you certainly may do that, although after many years, we now use the urine pH and have that as sufficient. Now, on the next slide, we looked at some of what we have reviewed, some of it at a high level, some of it in more detail, on the prevalence of different cancers and their distribution in men and women and origins, the anti-cancer mechanisms that we all have and depend upon, cytotoxic T cells, natural killer cells, immune responses to circulating tumor cells. And when we have elective, protective immune defense and repair systems, then the abnormal cells are identified overnight and eliminated every day. There are a variety of cancer detection markers, and we've reviewed them as best we can, at least in a high level way, with the takeaway being that for individuals, comparing them with themselves over time, the tests have more value. As a single screen for cancer, they lack enough sensitivity and specificity. Environmental influences are profound today, from pesticides and herbicides like glyphosate to household processed goods and cleaning materials and personal care items and prions. And to evoke our repair mechanisms, we want to use predictive biomarkers and self-tests interpreted to best outcome values. We want to choose the diets that promote good digestive health, that also promote anti-cancer mechanisms. We want to have enough of the nutrients from nutrient-dense foods and also supplements, and have restorative sleep. And then recognizing that our mind and body are always connected, we want to have practices that evoke spiritual healing, that respect and acknowledge the mind-body connections, and that spontaneous remission, even from serious illness, is something that has been well studied and characterized. Now, on the next slide, we see that the module 5 is about banishing cancer. Cancer used to be rare, it's now common. I think cancer is largely a choice, and so is how we manage cancer. And I will just comment that I was taught, was mentored, that if you have to deliver the message to a human being that they have cancer, as soon as you use the word cancer, stop until they start talking again. Because almost no one can remember what the doctor said after the word cancer was articulated. So sometimes I think one of the helpful things I do is just sit with a person in silence until they have something to ask, say, or reveal. And I have often had the privilege of being with another human being who trusted me enough to tell me what they hadn't told other doctors. And here I'm actually thinking of a woman, the mother of dear friends of mine, both accomplished professors. Her husband was one of the founders of the American Cancer Society. And she developed a very unusual kind of cancer. And I asked her why she thought she had developed cancer. And she was silent for some time, and then a few tears came, and she said, "For a long time, I kept the flame of love in my heart alive for both of us. And when that went out, I felt as if cancer would, quote, get me." I'm also happy to tell you that she went into remission, in part by speaking what was in her mind and heart that she had felt unwelcome, or she had not been encouraged, shall I say, to speak what was in her heart or burdening her heart. And just sharing, just reevaluation counseling, just sharing with another caring person and mirroring back what they say, not telling them what to do, just making them know that you heard what they said and you're checking to make sure you heard it correctly. It's called reevaluation counseling. I believe it's a Quaker technique. There are other similar techniques like Rogerian therapy, which is very similar. There are some other Buddhist techniques, Buddhist therapy techniques that are similar. So being with another person who is afflicted is an important part of our mission in evoking human healing responses. Now, Melissa, if we have any questions or folks who have comments, I'm eager, and I think we have a few minutes.
Yes, Dr. Jaffe, just hang on one second. Cookware seems to be a common theme. Can you talk about how you transitioned your kitchen? I know that you did a makeover a few years ago,
Right.
and talk about ceramic cookware.
No, happy to do that. Yes, I think almost all of us need a makeover. Most people benefit from having a cast iron wok, a tagine. Now, a tagine is an interesting Moroccan or Northern African traditional device. The base is almost always cast iron. The top is usually ceramic. And you put the food to be cooked in the top, which has a bit of a cone to it, a shape to it. And then you turn that over and you put it on very low heat. And now the moisture from the food cooks the food at lower temperature, making it more nutritious and delicious. And if you include nutrient-dense herbs and spices, even better, both for taste and benefit. I recommend a slow cooker of some kind. I recommend a pressure cooker. Kunri Khan is my choice. I recommend a food processor, and specifically the Breville. There are a number of them that are good, but the Breville is specifically designed for easy function and use. You can make nut butters with it. I just successfully made some hummus with it. What else is core to us? You need a skillet, and I recommend a cast iron skillet as big as you can. I have a 14-inch one that allows me to move things like onions or grated vegetables around so that they don't burn, but they do mix it up, if you will. What else do we have? I have what are called professional pots. So these on the outside are copper, and if you actually clean them well, they're gorgeous. The inside has multiple layers of metal, but the thing that touches your food is a very high-grade stainless steel that does not have the usual toxic metals that stainless steel often has. Other than that, I have a French press and a Breville grinder to convert the shade-grown organic Hawaiian coffee beans for my morning coffee. I have a hot water maker that makes tea or coffee or anything that you want hot water for. I'm trying to mentally look around my kitchen right now. I have an immersion blender. This is basically something that's tall and you can put it into a stew or into a soup and puree things in real time. I invested in some used but high quality Japanese knives. This is called Damascus steel. The ones that I have, as thin as they are, the starting piece of metal was folded under heat and pressure 40 times and then polished into the blade. And I have a whetstone that is a way of sharpening the edges of the knife. I prefer the traditional. You can get an electronic knife sharpener, but I actually find that to give you less quality and less experience. I personally look for reasons to use my body in the process of making the foods that we're going to eat. The grasses, the vegetables, the fruits, the herbs and spices and edible flowers, the salads that are served without dressing, but contain lots of nutrient-dense quality things. What else in the way of utensils? Oh, we have a variety of whisks. We have a variety of strainers. We have a variety of traditional ways of separating solid from liquid. And I do recommend that you start every meal with something wet and warm. It could be just warm spring water with a squeeze of lemon or lime. It could be berries that you have pureed and made into a warm beverage. It could be a broth or a soup. But start every meal with something wet and warm. Eat until you're half full. Eat until you're half satisfied. And then stop for 5 minutes. And my mentors encouraged their students to do one thing at a time. So when we would be eating, we would only eat. And then at the pause, we could talk. And if after about 5 minutes, you still want to eat some more or have some whole fruit for dessert, you're welcome to do that. But it's a way of taking in what your body needs and then respecting your body to say, thank you, I have enough for now, so that you can digest, assimilate, and eliminate the foods you eat without immune defense and repair burdens. If I think of anything else that I think is really important in terms of the kitchen makeover utensils, I'll mention that to you, Melissa, offline, and we can add that when we post this online.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. There's a question that just came in. Are you concerned about potential iron overload with cast iron cookware?
I am not concerned about iron overload, but yes, you do get a certain amount of iron from your cast iron cookware. But now let's talk about iron. It's really important, but the ferrous form, the preferred form is the +2, not the ferric +3. If you have a C cleanse, if you take in vitamin C, the ascorbate keeps the iron in the +2 ferrous form, which the body can handle. And if you have more than you need, it's excreted in urine, sweat, and stool. It's the ferric iron that causes hemochromatosis, hemosiderosis, and harm. And something I would like people to be aware of is that ascorbate only increases iron uptake if you need it. If you're low in iron, ascorbate increases the iron uptake. But if you have enough iron, ascorbate does not increase the iron uptake. So ascorbate is your friend. And I actually learned this from an FDA lawyer, and I was talking with him about iron and vitamin C. And he says, you know, Russ, that there's a monograph actually at FDA about the benefits for people with hemosiderosis and hemochromatosis and iron overload to take vitamin C to reduce the excess ferric by converting ferric to ferrous iron. I said, really? Where is that? He said, in the library. And he meant the physical library. I've looked for it online. I can't yet find it online. But Eugene Lambert, was chief counsel at the Food and Drug Administration, then went into the private practice of law, and he was our guide for many, many years. And he pointed out how helpful but not harmful ascorbate is in regard to iron. So yes, you do increase the iron uptake if you use cast iron, but that's actually a good thing, not a bad thing, especially if you're taking enough ascorbate based on the C cleanse and staying out of oxidative damage by reducing the toxins, environmental toxins that are all around, but you can reduce by about 80%. Oh, the previous question included the question about ceramic cookware. There is ceramic cookware and even ceramic knives that I think are an excellent choice. They're best for baking and roasting. They generally are used in the oven. I have a convection oven and then I have a standard oven. And yes, I think ceramic cookware, especially if you get the ones that say very specifically, they market and promote themselves by saying, our ceramic glaze is food grade, it's BPA, BPS free, it doesn't have any toxins in it. So there are ceramics that are coated and ceramics that are uncoated. My ceramics come from Romer, R-O-M-E-R. Romer Topf is the company, it's a European company, and they make unglazed ceramic items of a very high quality. They're a bit of an investment, but they last a long time and you can pass them on to anyone else you care about.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. Another question that just came in is that you haven't mentioned skin cancer, and how do you see basal cell carcinoma versus cancer in internal organs?
Well, very good question, because as we looked in the beginning of this module, skin cancer, melanoma is going up. Basal cell carcinomas are very common, but they're an indication that the immune defense and repair anti-cancer mechanisms are weak. It means you have shifted from elective protective into survival mode. And yes, a basal skin carcinoma, a basal skin cancer, can be easily laser removed, in essence, laser shaved. But I prefer, and I have done this with my own father and mother, what I prefer is to start by taking drops of liquid vitamin D that has a little bit of glycerol in it. And for 30 seconds a day, rub it into the irregular zone spot of skin that you have concern might be what we would call a basal cell carcinoma. As a pathologist, I should know, and I think I do know, what a basal cell carcinoma might look like. But instead of biopsying, which I think is invasive, it causes a little scar, I recommend physiology before pharmacology, or physiology before procedures. If it's really a basal cell carcinoma and you follow this guidance, this module's guidance, and you add the vitamin D directly on the surface, directly on the irregular, quote, lesion on the skin, you'll end up with beautiful skin and no scar most of the time. Now, if you do what I say and it continues to grow, or what we call fungate, well, then you need someone to do what I would call an excisional biopsy. That is, you get clean margins. You don't just poke at it with a needle. If you need to, when in doubt, take it out, but do physiology before pharmacology, and you may be pleasantly surprised how effective the body's innate anti-cancer mechanisms are when you renew, rehabilitate, and restore them. I will add, now that I'm thinking about the question, there is an old-fashioned treatment. It's called podophyllin. Basically, it's an extract from mold that riles up the immune defense system, especially the T cells, and is associated with remissions in some basal cell skin cancers. Melanoma is different. Melanoma, you don't want melanoma. And you want to be systemic about managing the health of a person with melanoma or at risk of skin cancer. I will take this opportunity to share with the group that all of the high SPF lotions and materials that are sold to block the sun, they promote as many skin cancers as they prevent. And I actually put together a review about 15 years ago on this subject. There has been more since then. You don't want to use a high SPF tanning lotion or suntan lotion. So what do you want to use? Because you don't want to become red like a lobster. Turns out a few drops of sesame oil or shea butter or the herbal butter of your choice. And yes, the neck and the nose are vulnerable, so you might use zinc oxide on the nose, and you might actually wear a hat that would have a floppy part in the back that would cover your neck. And I will tell a quick story, because we were in Mexico together, and we went out in a small boat. This is Laguna San Ignacio, where gray whales birth from January to March. It's a very safe place for them. There, at any moment in time, there are about 700 moms and hundreds of calves, baby whales. So we went out and we were having a very good time. And I became red as a lobster. And my friend said, "You better put something over you. Can we give you a poncho?" I said, no. When we get back, I'm going to take a dose of vitamin C. I'm going to take a little more vitamin D. I'm going to take my usual supplements, including Repair Guard. And I promise in the morning I'll have a tan. And they actually wagered, because people were certain that I was going to be moaning at night because it looked like I had a terrible sunburn. But it was selenomethionine, because the next morning when I had a tan, people wanted to know what I did. And I said, the secret sauce. Now, it was all of the things, not just this, but it was the selenomethionine that helped transduce the electrons that would cause the skin to, quote, burn. And in fact, it just increased the flow of electrons into my mitochondria and actually built up my ATP. And several of the people who were there, this was Amory Lovins and his wife, Judy, this was Peter Stranger and his wife, and his son, sorry, Clay, very small group of us, but a very interesting group of people. And Amory immediately called up Eric Rasmussen, who used to be Surgeon General of the Third Fleet, a very fine guy. If you have a disaster anywhere in the world, Eric's the guy to call. And Eric was not aware of the difference between selenomethionine, selenite, and selenate, because they're all selenium. But one is nature's form, others are, quote, workalikes. And as you heard from me before, and you'll probably hear from me again, respect nature, work in harmony with nature, you get many, many synergistic and unexpected benefits. Try to fool Mother Nature, and you end up feeling foolish because she doesn't like to be fooled. So selenite and selenate, no. Selenomethionine, yes. Selenomethionine and vitamins E, all the tocopherols and tocotrienols, and the other ones, the carotenoids and the B complex and all of the above. It's a full team. It's a full suite of needed nutrients, needed more today than ever, as first-line comprehensive care if you want to survive the 21st century, which is a much more hazardous, stressful, intoxicated century than the ones before.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. Another question just came in. Dr. Norm Sheely has a gamma PEMF device that he likes. This practitioner says that she doesn't know what to think of this therapy. And is there any problem with the EMF with this therapy?
Well, when you say PEMF, you're talking about pulsed electromagnetic field therapy. The answer is that it is, to the best of my understanding and review of the science, a placebo. It evokes human healing response 1 out of 3 times, but so does everything. Now, I'm just enough of an engineer to be able to have a conversation about pulsed electromagnetic frequencies. Is this going to be a mat that I sleep on? Is this going to be a yoga mat that I sit on or stretch on? How close am I going to be to these fields? Because the fields reduce, they diminish, as the cube, as the third power. So very quickly, with small distances, you have very little field. And the people that I know, including Norm Sheely, who is a friend of mine, and I was, for full disclosure, the first chairman of the scientific committee of the American Holistic Medical Association in the 1970s. Norm was the founding president. Paul Brenner, was one of the distinguished members. And I think PEMF is elegant. I don't think we know much about it. I think the body is electromagnetic, which makes it interesting, but it's also electrochemical. And I want to use physiology. What is physiology in this regard? Physiology means doing Hatha Prana Yoga, the stretching and breathing of yoga, or Tai Chi Chuan. Because the purpose of pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, PEMF, the purpose is to increase the lymphatic and vascular flow and stimulate your body to repair itself. Huh. Sounds a lot like Tai Chi Chuan and Hatha Prana Yoga to me. Or you could do therapeutic Pilates. You could use the Feldenkrais method, or in that Baniel's version of the Feldenkrais method. You could use Traeger Mentastics, a la Dean Juhan and Roger Toll. I have found benefit from all of them in the hands of someone who is gifted and passionate about the service that they provide.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. And one more question here. Is there a good OTC morning urine test? So any recommendation for pH papers? Does it have to be a specific?
Oh, thank you. Now I understand the question. Thank you. Yes, it must be what's called high sensitivity pH 5.5 to 8 pH paper. You can get it from us, you can get it from Hydrion, you can get it from pharmacies, but it must be the high sensitivity pH 5.5 to 8, not the 0 to 12 chemical pH paper, but the physiologic pH paper. And then you have to use it after 6 or more hours of rest and interpret it the way we suggest. Now, the self-test that I referenced, if you had the kit for the urine pH self-test, that comes with enough for 10 tests. It comes with the strips and a little log and instructions so that, you know, people don't forget what you said on the way out the door. So the reason we put the self-tests or self-assessments together was so that you could have a tool that you could provide your clients that's very inexpensive, but very high leverage, high value in terms of helping you help them to get better.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaffe. Looks like that's all for the questions today. Any parting words that you'd like to share with the group before we head out?
Well, I hope everyone has received, but if not, please ask us for the updated COVID-19 Banish the Virus ebook, little monograph. I hope everyone participated and saw us on the Immune Health Summit recently. More summits to follow. We'll keep you informed about that. My comment, especially in regard to viral pandemics and miasms. And by the way, later this month, I'm giving a keynote for an international conference on traditional Oriental medicine. And my title is 21st Century Miasms and Pandemics, Solutions You Can Use. So first, I'm going to point out that miasms, that is the fear that goes along with the infection, the pandemic, compounds the problem, especially when you're not getting clear information about what to be afraid of or how to manage your fear. And then I'm going to point out that it's the people with the comorbidities that have the problems. The people with the comorbidities due to weight and diabetes or carbohydrate metabolism issues, immune defense and repair issues, with the emphasis on the repair deficit and the inflammation and the autoimmunity, but also people with lung or heart prior insult and damage. It turns out a lot of young people either use tobacco or vape, or they're exposed to air pollution and have problems from hypertension to pulmonary, to coagulation and others. And so when people talk and report about these unexpected catastrophes, as we said originally, and we say more strongly in our update, this is all too predictable and understandable based on antioxidants like ascorbate dropping to essentially undetectable levels at the same time that cell acidosis, magnesium choline citrate deficiency compounds the problem. So I think we are very fortunate today to know more and more about cancer and how to prevent it, how to reverse it, how to remit it, if you will, and how to manage it. It does exist. It's always existed. You can go back to mummies in Egypt, and there were some cancers then. But even then, when you look very carefully at those mummies, there seemed to be environmental and behavioral influences that added to the risk rather than reduced the problem. So please live in harmony with your nature, but get to know your nature. Please evoke your human healing responses in the way these modules suggest. And know that a healthy person, while they do make abnormal and cancer cells every day, eliminates them effectively. So stay in that elective protective mode. Don't let yourself shift into survival mode for all the reasons we've talked about and we'll talk about again. So be well, happy, and restored.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe.